تحياتي للجميع. We'll get started in about a minute. So if you guys have any questions, please fire it up before we start. If you want to ask it through the chat, or I can unmute you if you want to, ask it directly. Okay, so the lecture today is about bunnies, huh? Okay, we have a question. In non-REM sleep, all of our muscles shut down. شو رأيكم يا جماعة؟ Non-REM sleep. What do you think? So الشت داون muscle shut down بصير عندنا في الريم sleep ما اتفقنا complete atonia. It's in the REM sleep إذا بتتذكروا ال reticular activating system, ascending activating system. So REM sleep, yes. I mean, not all muscles مثل ما اتفقنا. ليش؟ لأنه اسمه REM sleep, rapid eye movement. ال eye movement بتصير عن طريق إيش؟ عن طريق ocular muscles. So not all muscles. And of course not the muscles, for example, of respiration, الأشياء اللي controlled in the midbrain, cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, etc. The gut is working, the GI is working. So not all muscles. Okay, I'm talking about skeletal muscles here that receive, that actually are activated through the corticospinal tracts in particular. Okay. So for REM sleep, non-REM sleep, not non-REM sleep. Another question. In the basal ganglia, the output of the globus pallidus internal goes to the thalamus, whereas pars reticulata goes to the superior colliculus. No, both of them go to the thalamus, different parts of the thalamus. In 3 out of 4 what we called corticostriatal loops، إذا بتتذكروا. الوحيدة اللي بتروح فيها من الريتيكولاتا على السوبر كورتيكولس هي الاوكيلوموتور فقط. اوكي، mainly for our understanding طبعا. So I hope this answers the question. Okay, doke. So let's see. So today it's going to be a bit of a different topic. What's the difference between the 6th and the 5th editions of the book? Which book are we talking about? I actually teach from 3, 4 different books. Are you talking about Purvey's neuroscience, whether you're talking about principles of neuroscience, whether you're talking about learning and memory, هون راح نحكي عن learning and memory textbook. So it depends on which book you're talking about. But generally, there aren't a lot of really big differences. So I wouldn't really worry about that. في الأشياء اللي أنتم بتاخدوها يعني you shouldn't really worry about it. There aren't really significant changes. So basically, I use the chapter that I gave to you guys in terms of the PDF. These concepts, were not updated really over the past, some of them over the past 100 years, some of them over the past 30 years, some of them over the past 50 years. So yeah, if they were updated, I would let you know, of course. بس طبعا if you're working in the field of research, you should know that actually things are very different. As you're not researchers, so basically this is not something you need to worry about. Unless you want to learn more. In deep brain stimulation, can it be used in hypo and hyperkinetic disorders? Possibly, yes. It's actually, there are cases where people use DBS to treat what we call chorea and choreoathetosis, aspects of movement disorders. So yes, and Tourette's syndrome and other aspects of these, of these disorders. It's more commonly used in Parkinson's these days. But you can actually see with hyperkinetic disorders, DBS being used. Different targets for DBS, depending on some of them are functionally related, some of them are actually imaging related. So it's not always the same one. So that the short answer is yes. The long answer is it requires details. All right. Any other questions? Okie doke. So basically, today, the topic of discussion is going to be a little bit different. راح نبلش نحكي في functional aspect of physiology. So people call it biological psychology or psychological biology, whatever you want to refer to it, or psychophysiology in this kind of context. And basically, that's how we want to think about it. The main mechanism of action in DBS, I mentioned this last time, right? It's not releasing neurotransmitters. Go back to the lecture. We were talking about breaking the synchrony, affecting the beta oscillation. All right. All right. So let's get to the lecture, and then for any other questions, we'll give you guys a chance either in the break or at the very end, so that you can ask more questions. Okay. اليوم راح نحكي عن what we call associative learning. And associative learning is the foundation of what we call memory, okay? But what type of memory? هذا كلام راح تحكوا عنه أكثر مع دكتور حاتم, which is who's going to be covering memory this year with you guys. And in particular نحكي عن شيء بنسميه procedural memory, okay? Procedural memory as opposed to semantic memory, okay? So so that being said, how do we learn to associate a stimulus with a response? So in kind of the response by choice or automatic in this kind of context. كيف يعني? What do I mean by this? Let's take an example. Pavlov's dog. مين بيعرف شو قصة Ivan Pavlov? What was the experiment that Pavlov did actually on the dog that allowed us to basically start this kind of field? Any ideas? Yes, the one with the bell. Who wants to unmute themselves and tell us very briefly, very quickly, so that we don't waste a lot of time on the chat? Okay, so it's it's not conditioned reflex, it's a conditioned response. So شو اللي بصير? What did Pavlov do in this kind of context? Actually, Pavlov was training the dog that you see in the picture that every time a bell rings, the dog would expect to be fed. And actually, Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. He was a physiologist who was studying the gastrointestinal system. He was studying actually how gastric juices are being produced and are being or generate basically the feeding behavior. And he got the Nobel Prize on that. And then ultimately, so تيما is telling us كل ما كان يرن الجرس تزيد كمية السلايفا لأنه ربط الأكل عند الكلب في صوت الجرس. Exactly, that's it. So basically, what we're talking about in this experiment is once Pavlov rang the bell, after a few repetitions of ring the bell, feed the dog, ring the bell, feed the dog, صار الكلب كل ما يسمع صوت الجرس it would start salivating. So شو اللي صار عندنا هون? What happens? what is the bell? يعني if I ring the bell right now, does it mean anything to you? The answer is no. But actually, this is what we call the unconditioned stimulus. So the stimulus, it's a stimulus, okay? ليش stimulus؟ لأنه we're using our senses. يعني in other words, شيء مسموع، شيء نقدر نشوفه، شيء نقدر نحسه، okay? In this kind of domain. شيء نقدر ندوقه، شيء نقدر نشمه. So any kind of sense can be used for producing what we call the US, the unconditioned stimulus. Okay? So remember this, the US, unconditioned stimulus. The bell, أول مرة Pavlov rang the bell, it meant nothing to the dog at that point. ليش؟ لأنه ما كان يعرف شو راح يصير بعد البell. All right? So at that point we call it unconditioned stimulus. طيب with repetitions, with different trials, صار عندي, and basically let's take the second component, the unconditioned response. يعني احنا when we're talking about salivating or saliva production, it was not conditioned to be dependent on something. It was only dependent on the presentation of the food initially. مظبوط؟ يعني presentation of the food بيعمل عند الكلب salivation. Okay? And that's why we call it unconditioned response in this kind of case. يعني ما له علاقة في bell ringing in this at this stage. And when the training happens, يعني what we see here, so before the bell rang, it was called US. Now the bell rang, food was presented, and it was being associated. So US, unconditioned stimulus, is being associated with what we're calling a UR, an unconditioned response, with training. So اسمه conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. ليش؟ لأنه at that point, you can actually remove the food. Every time Pavlov rang the bell, without even giving the dog food, salivation happened. So the saliva production became independent to some extent of the middle feature, which is the presentation of the food. Okay? So شايفين كيف basically هنا, so unconditioned stimulus صار عندي is basically the food in this kind of regard. كمان مرة نمشي في الترتيب. Food, salivation, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. لما ضفنا conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, with the unconditioned response, and we trained the dog on that, after a while, the bell is going to be called the conditioned stimulus. Even without the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, is going to produce what we call a conditioned response. Okay? So لما كان association between the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and the unconditioned response, which is the salivation, okay? The CS was still being associated with the food. لما شلنا unconditioned stimulus, UR صار اسمه CR, okay? Conditioned response. Conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. Is it clear? This is the foundation. رجاء إذا ما كان هذا الconcept clear, let me know so that we can focus and discuss it a little bit further. Okay? So pretty simple, straightforward. And راح نبني عليه كثيرا بس يعني I want you to really be very careful understanding this particular concept. And ultimately, as you can see with Pavlov's dog, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, the unconditioned response is salivation, conditioned stimulus is the bell, and after that presentation, conditioned response becomes the salivation, okay? Why did we call the food unconditioned stimulus? لأنه it's not the sense aspect of it, okay? We're not focusing on something heard. It's actually more of a natural process, all right? So انا عارف انه the food has a smell and has appearance and so on and so forth. ممكن حد يجي يحكي لي الريحه تبعت الاكل او شكل الاكل او ملمس الاكل. Yes, I agree. بس هلا احنا just for simplification and simplicity, we call it unconditioned stimulus لانه بدنا نضيف كمان conditioned stimulus اللي هو البell. Okay. So that being said, food with salivation is a natural process that happens all the time, and it's not something that you need training to understand. It's part of your instincts. بينما البell is something that you train the food on. واضحة؟ Okay. So basically, in this kind of context, you can apply this to any kind of behavioral correlates in your environment. Okay. So that being said, if إذا تسمعوا مثلا صوت سيارة الغاز ولا سيارة البوظة ولا اللي بيجمعوا جنك مثلا basically, there is always something that happens, all right? يعني مثلا if you بتسمع سيارة حدا ببيع خضرة, you want to go and you want to rush and actually buy from them, okay? So أو مثلا نحكي عن سيارة البوظة, which is actually this is something the ice cream truck example. You start actually craving ice cream. So as you can see, there's the unconditioned response is the appetite for ice cream. Once you hear that ice cream truck basically approaching, and then ultimately يعني عادة لازم تشوفوا الايس كريم truck in order to produce the appetite for ice cream. بس إذا بتسمعوا الموسيقى اللي بتعزفها سيارة البوظة, then actually this will lead to the US and then ultimately will lead to the UR initially in, with training, okay? بعدين امتى ما تسمعوا صوت سيارة البوظة you immediately get appetite for ice cream. You see, so شلنا اليو اس من النص اللي هو the site of the ice cream truck. So there's a question. The bell, when first used, was not a stimulus at this point, right? It was actually being introduced as a conditioned stimulus. Yes, it meant nothing for the dog, but with training, the association happened. All right? Got the point? So that's actually really how it works. So it's all about training and getting used to stuff, and acquaintance and making things familiar. And it's very dangerous sometimes, especially في الوضع اللي عايشينه حاليا. صار عادي الواحد يفتح الأخبار ويشوف صور المصايب اللي بنشوفها كل يوم, right? And then basically it becomes normalized, right? So basically that's why you have to retrain yourself all the time that this is not okay. And see these pictures and what's happening is absolutely not okay. So this is one way to think about it, all right? So it's actually something that we call tolerance. راح نحكي عنه كمان مرة في المحاضرة هنا. شو يعني tolerance؟ في البداية actually let's talk about our own reality. في بداية الحرب اللي كنا نشوفها, كنت تشوف الصور and you would start crying and you would start feeling bad about what's happening and so on and so forth. هلا بتشوف نفس الصور ممكن ما تأثرش فيك أبدا. Why? What's the behavior that explains that? And ultimately, how can you still positively care about helping people and about um, um, trying to look at things in a different kind of or trying to understand things in a different way, بحيث انه ما يأثرش الواحد على قدرته على اساس to do your parts as well and not to affect your well-being, although that's going to be really difficult. So let's talk more about conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, I'm sorry, unconditioned response, and then conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. And خلينا نحكي شوي عن ال unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus في حالة في examples اللي أعطيناهم was either food or ice cream. These are positive things. okay. بينما ممكن الإكزامبل الأخير اللي شايفينه in front of you is when you actually hear the rain falling, you close the windows or you close the the what is it called, the curtains or something in this context, مشان انه نسكر الشبابيك مشان ما يدخلش المطر على الدار. مظبوط. This is the immediate action that we do. This is the conditioned response, the unconditioned response. بينما لاحقا بصير الواحد يتوقع انه راح تشتت الدنيا لما يشوف الدنيا غيمت، فبصير يعمل الاكشن that actually is about closing the windows or closing the drapes and or closing the curtains, based on this unconditioned response, or basically based on this unconditioned stimulus اللي هو rain falling. Okay. نطلع نلم الغسيل exactly, which is also a very positive way of thinking about it. I completely agreed. So you can apply this anywhere, and that's the point. بس النقطة اللي بدنا نحكي عنها حاليا is شايفين conditioned response أو unconditioned response ممكن يكون positive outcome or negative outcome. وبناء عليه ممكن نقسم هاي العملية اللي بنشوفها احنا to شيء بنسميه appetitive conditioning and aversive conditioning. Appetitive بكل بساطة لما يكون unconditioned response or the conditioned عفوا unconditioned stimulus is positive. If I said unconditioned response, I was wrong. Unconditioned stimulus, okay? The US, if it's positive, okay, we are calling this process appetitive conditioning, okay? And if it's negative, the US, we call it aversive conditioning. Got it? أو في حدا بيحكي إنه لما يكون حد بخاف من صوت إشي مثلا زي الرعد والبرق، هل هو بنفس الطريقة اللي بيكون فيها هذا الخوف؟ هلا راح نشوف. Yes, the answer, short answer is yes. And we'll see this in what we call fear conditioning. And that's actually one of my research specialties. I worked a lot on fear and how fear is generated in the brain. We'll show you a bit of my own studies as well. Okay. So positive US again. Food is a positive US. You see, unconditioned stimulus here. It's a positive US. Ice cream, truck is a positive US. Rain is a negative US. Got it? So that's what we mean by the US. It's something that relates to the instincts, and that relates that actually something that happens naturally in your environment or in your ambience. مثل اللي جاب الإكزامبل البرق والرعد. Okay. So كمان مرة لأنه you have to understand this. There is a bell that was introduced to the dog. It was not associated with anything. When you ring the bell to the dog, it means nothing initially. If you ring the bell, feed the dog starts salivating. And with time, بصير ringing the bell is associated with introducing the food and therefore the salivation. After a while, with training, even just ringing the bell would produce salivation. فسميناها CS, conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, US, which is the food, and it's already associated with salivation, as I know. Before training, salivation was called an unconditioned response. In this kind of context, when the US is not presented, we call it conditioned response. كمان مرة مهم جدا نفهم الفرق بين ال CS وال US وال UR اللي راح لاحقا بصير CR. اوكي؟ تمام. Interrupt me guys if you don't understand any of these concepts. Very important لأنه مهم جدا في هاي المحاضرة في البداية، وفيما سنناقشه لاحقا as well during the day, which is the second lecture. تمام. Okay, so we're almost halfway there. بناء على هذا الكلام اجوا two scientists actually. واحد اسمه B.F. Skinner and the other is called W.K. Estes. Bill Estes and B.F. Skinner. في 1940 and so on كانت الحرب العالمية الثانية قائمة. So Bill Estes and Skinner noticed that when the Germans actually invented the rockets and started attacking London and the rest of Britain, basically الصاروخ له صوت محدد basically under these circumstances. So basically when the Britons actually would hear the sound of the rocket, they would actually stop doing whatever they're doing لحد ما يصير الانفجار بعدين بيكملوا. If they're talking, they stop talking. If they're walking, they stop walking. If they're eating, they stop eating. You see, they freeze basically while hearing the explosion. Then things continue in this kind of regard. And لاحظوا هذا الكلام Bell, Estes, and Skinner. And therefore they designed a behavioral paradigm to study this freezing behavior. شايفين هذا التوقف عن العمل سموه freezing, which is a measure of basically how much you're affected by the negative outcome that's going to happen, which is basically, or the expected outcome which is going to happen, which is basically the explosion. إذن شو CS هنا وشو US, and what is basically the unconditioned response or conditioned response? Any ideas? The explosion is the CS, are you sure? The sound is the US, متأكدين؟ صوت الصاروخ is the CS, okay? لما أسمع صوت الصاروخ something happens. لأنه بسمع صوت الصاروخ بصير انفجار, something happens, okay? Initially, لما أسمع صوت انفجار I freeze, okay? Alright? لما أسمع صوت الانفجار the freezing happens. بس لاحقا صاروا الناس يعرفوا إنه لما أسمع صوت الصاروخ هيصير انفجار and then I'll freeze. You see? So that's how it happens. Got it? So بناء عليه لما أسمع صوت الصاروخ صارت لاحقا I freeze. راح basically الانفجار اللي بالنص. And then الانفجار became more of a subsequent aspect of it. إنه okay, I freeze until the explosion happens. And that's how we think about it. All right? So the unconditioned response that later became conditioned to the sound of the rocket is called now conditioned response. All right? ليش؟ لأنه بطل له علاقة في الانفجار، صار له علاقة في صوت الانطلاق تبع الصاروخ. تمام. إذا بناء على هذا الكلام they redesigned this experiment, Estes and Skinner. طب how did they do that? They actually food restricted rats. لما الجرذان جوعوهم and then actually put them in شيء بيسموه Skinner boxes with a lever. So the rat actually would keep pressing the lever to get food dispensed for them. ولما يكون the rat is hungry, then actually they continue to press the lever. بالإضافة إلى ذلك شو عمل Estes? He added a mesh زي شبكة حديد at the base of the Skinner box. And then basically he started injecting current. صار يعمل electric shock في البيس of the Skinner box. طبعا it's a mild electric shock, but just the purpose of it is to startle the rat. فultimately and صار يدرب الرات الجوعان اللي actually is basically is pressing the lever. لما يسمع صوت التون the shock will follow. Okay? So السؤال اللي بيحدث فجأة بيكون unconditioned بعدين بيصير conditioned. If we train them, yes. بس احنا بنحكي عن response هون. We're talking about the response. Yes. مع التريننج إذا بيحدث فجأة مرة واحدة, then it's absolutely not something that you will pay attention to later. Okay? Or maybe you would, but I don't know, you know, the details of that. But ultimately with training, if صار عندي co-occurrence للconditioned stimulus والunconditioned stimulus والunconditioned response, ساعتها حتى لو في شيء unconditioned stimulus, الconditioned stimulus راح يعطيني conditioned response. You see the point? Got it? واضحة المسألة؟ Okay, ممتاز. إذا نرجع ل Estes and Skinner in this kind of regard. So basically, a rat is pressing the lever, all right? Every time they press the lever, the food is dispensed. And then now this tone comes in. أول مرة سمعوا التون ما عرفوا شو يعني tone. بعدين one second later they got shocked. They got a foot shock. لاحقا صار كل ما تيجي التون, the rat that is hungry will stop pressing the lever, will freeze until the shock happens. You see? So عندي conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus هو عبارة عن الشوك, and then the conditioned response or unconditioned response that converted into conditioned response اللي هو freezing. Got it? نترجمها كمان مرة الإكزامبل تبع الصاروخ. صوت الصاروخ, انفجار, and then ultimately basically the freezing aspect of it. Got it? Then this is one example of what we call aversive conditioning. ليش؟ لأنه ال US has a negative aspect to it. Shock. It's painful. All right? Or startling. ممكن نعمل هذا الكلام عن طريق الأودرز. زي ما تشوفوا في الفروت فلايز هنا. They were basically put in عفوا الconditioned stimulus ممكن نعمله بصوت, which is a tone, and then ultimately with others as well. وبرضه unconditioned stimulus ممكن يكون shock. ممكن sometimes we use actually others that are offensive others, or actually negative others that are not really not something that the animals can tolerate. We can use so زي ما شفتوا في الشوك we can use some things that are somatosensory as well. We can use bright light flashes. We can use bad taste or good taste. We use sugar, or we use some other chemicals that give a bad taste. So you see, that's actually the issue here. Can you repeat what was the CS and the CR in the rat example? The CS was the tone. Whenever the tone was presented, the rat would freeze. Stop pressing the lever. ليش؟ لأنه بداية الرات جوعان. It will keep pressing the lever. بعدين صار عندي presentation للtone that is associated with a shock. CS US. ببداية كل ما الرات يصير عنده shock, we give the rat a foot shock, بصير UR, which is freezing. They would stop pressing the lever. بعدين لاحقا صار كل ما نعطي tone, the rat would stop actually pressing the lever, even without the shock, without the US. Got the point? So the CR is freezing, yes. When you present the tone and actually the rat freezes, then yes, that's actually the CS-CR association, even without the shock. ذكر الإكزامبل تبع Pavlov, which is when Pavlov rang the bell, the dog started salivating without the food. Got it? Here's another example, basically where we have two otters, 1 and 2. So the fruit flies were trained that otter 1 was safe, otter 2 they would get shocked, electric shock without actually burning them. So لما ينعطوا option between otter 1 and otter 2, they would all actually accumulate in the otter 1 end of the tube. ليش؟ لأنهم كمان مرة trained that actually this CS, this smell, predicts something negative, right? فشو عندي صار conditioned response? I want to move to the other end of the tube that has the other otter. Okay, so select right or left. Do you select right where you were shocked, or do you select left where you were not shocked? Got it? So that's the response that you would actually notice there. Okay. I mentioned to you tolerance. Let me see if I have an example on that. I don't think I have an example on that. But anyways, we'll talk about it in a second. And so ultimately, we can actually apply this again in so many different behavioral paradigms. One of the paradigms is called eye blink conditioning. Eye blink conditioning is basically a product of Clark Hall, who was one of basically the founders of the field of mathematical psychology and mathematical cognitive science, which is one of my specializations as well. I can tell you that. And basically, Hull would actually do the experiments in a very crude manner. And بدنا نشوف امتى الواحد بيرمش basically, okay? And then ultimately what he did was every time he played a tone, he slapped his student, basically in a very crude manner. And بناء على هذا الكلام, with time, كمان مرة, tone, slap, eye blink. مين بده يحكي لي شو السي اس، شو اليو اس، وشو اليو ار اللي صار لاحقا؟ CR كيف بصير CR? Quickly, if you can unmute yourself, that's going to save us time. CS is the tone. CS is the tone. US is slap, they shock. And the UR is that became CR is the blinking. Exactly. So بناء عليه, you play a tone, the student gets slapped, they blink. لاحقا, if you just play a tone, the student blinks. صار عندي CS, CR. Okay? And again, appetitive ولا aversive? It is aversive. Absolutely. Okay, ممتاز. Unless you like somebody likes to be slapped, that's a different context, basically, which is not the norm. Okay, so basically, for eye blink conditioning, this is how we design it, but we don't design it actually with slaps. Thankfully, this was in the 20s, 1920s. We are in like almost 100 years after. As apparently humans are not evolving as they should be, even over the past 2,000 years. ولكن, what we do right now is instead of slap, which is the activation of the trigeminal nerve that we want to get here, what we do is we do an air puff to the eye. It's a little bit annoying, okay? So every time there is an air puff, you literally blink. And so you play a tone, the tone is associated with an air puff that happens, and then ultimately you start blinking. And so we measure electrical activity in the ocular muscles, and we'll talk about the neural circuit for that in the end by the end of this discussion. And then ultimately, so عندي CS, which is basically the tone, as you see in the headphones, عندي US, which is basically the air puff, and عندي UR initially, which is the blink. لاحقا, whenever you play the tone, the blink happens. فكمان مرة بنسميه eye blink conditioning. All right? And we do this a lot with bunnies and pigeons and so on and so forth, so multiple types of studies. And this is how it works. تمام. So there are multiple actually examples related to corneal reflex. No, it's not necessarily a test of the, it is actually, it could be a test of the corneal reflex. So basically, but it's the idea is the eye blink aspect of it. Okay, I want to see a behavioral expression, a response in this regard. It's not about the reflex in particular. All right, we're not measuring reflexes. We're measuring, the valence part of the response, which is a negative here. And it's not about like measuring the as what you do actually in a clinical setting to measure whether a reflex is functional or not. Okay. All right. So that being said, there are multiple examples about appetitive and aversive conditioning. You can look at these on your own, guys. So let's move forward and think about how do we learn a new association. So again, we present a CS that is paired with a US, that is paired with a UR, and over time, the CS is sufficient to think or actually to elicit what we call a CR, conditioned response. All right. So let me see. I wanted to mention a little bit about tolerance with time. I hope I don't forget. Yeah, this is actually what we call compensatory responses. Even the idea behind these compensatory responses is that with more training, you plateau. The response plateaus. You don't get new responding. على سبيل المثال, I'm sure as medical students, you're all, big on drinking coffee and drinking tea and energy drinks and so on and so forth. And with time, بيبطل إلها أثر نهائيا. Why does this happen? This is actually what we call tolerance in the field of behavioral science or cognitive science. And then ultimately مش بالضرورة له علاقة في الكافيين فقط يعني. Okay? لأنه ultimately with the smell of coffee, with you actually preparing the coffee or going to the shop to buy coffee, it becomes more of the preparatory behavioral, like a CS that produces a US, okay, that's associated with a US, and then produces a response. فبالتالي أول مرة بتشربوا فيها قهوة مثلا, you get this increase in alertness, you get this like heightening of the heart rate and blood pressure and so on and so forth. You feel great. بعدين with time, if you get the same amount of coffee with the same kind of sequence, the effect is not as it used to be. So شو اللي صار عندنا? اللي صار عندنا basically إنه the body actually got used to that. So every time they see the CS, they predict that the US is going to happen. Therefore, they give a compensatory response. يعني they lower the heart rate. Every time you smell coffee, your heart rate is going to go down. Your blood pressure is going to go down. مشان هيك الإفكت تبع الكوفي would be compensated for. It's not going to really raise your functionality. It will be plateau. It will be normal. Got it? How do we get over this? By breaking the habit. مشان هيك you need to diversify. مثلا if you want to consume caffeine, the best way around this is to do مثلا 4 days a week of caffeine and 3 days a week without caffeine. Basically, different types of caffeine, different smells, different looks of caffeine. أساس إنه you don't really learn the CS-US or the CS-US-UR or the CS-CR response. Okay? And then actually, because exactly, if you drink caffeine and you can go to sleep immediately after that. المفروض إنه caffeine increase alertness. طب كيف? How do you, drink coffee and sleep? If that's the case. لأنه في عندي صار compensatory response with the acclimation to the consumption of caffeine. فصار الجسم يستعد, ينزل الهارت rate, ينزل blood pressure, and then ultimately significantly lowers your level of alertness. And caffeine only compensates at this time. It doesn't give you the kick that used to give you in the past. فهذا بنسميه tolerance. And then ultimately you can see it actually very clearly in humans in the eye blink conditioning paradigm. شايفين on a plateau with trials, conditioned response بخف, بنزل. لأنه خلاص we kind of compensate for it. And in the field of cognitive science, in order actually to compensate for this, we use what is called probabilistic schedules. We'll talk about it in the second half of the lecture. And this is part of the homeostasis. Actually, if you want to read more about it, there is some really nice work on the concept called hormesis, okay, which is it's actually an ancient terminology where people used to train themselves on ingesting poisons this way. All right. هل بيقلل التولرنس لو ابتعد الشخص عن stimulus? Yes. So as I said, we can do 4 days, 3 days, 4 days with caffeine, 3 days without caffeine per week. Diversify. مثلا اعملوا يوم شاي أخضر, يوم قهوة, يوم قهوة خضراء, يوم شاي أسود, basically. So diversify the sources of caffeine so that you keep shocking your body, basically. It's like without the body being expecting or predicting what's going to come next. أضيفوا different flavors every time so that it continues to be confused so that you can get the kick out of your coffee, okay? Compensatory tolerance of fear, that's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Yes, there is, but actually this is what we call desensitization psychotherapy. With exposure to fear, it becomes, less, what is it called? Less impactful on the individual. Let me see. Somebody's raising their hands. Let me just make sure I respond. 1 second, guys. Okay, see. Okay, so that's the answer. I don't know if anybody raising their hands. I saw somebody raise their hands. If they're still there, let me know. I can't see anymore. Okay. Okay, so tolerance مفروض إنه واضح. If not, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to revisit this. And okay, so there's another example about the same stimulus, or what we call the US. then حكينا عن الطعام, food for the dog. Basically could be a US زي ما في حالة Pavlov's dog, or basically it could be an actual CS itself. So it could be a CS that leads to another US. that leads to another UR, okay? They're using sex here actually as an example of a CS, of a US that could be a CS in this kind of regard. So basically كيف هذا الكلام بيتم؟ بيتم basically إنه think of it as a sequence. لما عندي US we have a UR, okay? When I eat food, I actually, when I see food, I salivate, okay? So basically, this is a normal response. Or maybe basically every time I see or I smell food, I get up and actually go to seek the food, and then I get the and then I start salivating. عرفت كيف؟ So basically that's the sequence that could develop. فإذا كان في عندي intervening stimulus بين first stimulus and the response, then actually we call the first stimulus a CS حتى لو كان US. All right? Whether it's food presentation or sex in this kind of regard. Okay? So بقدر احط مع الاكل صوت بحيث انه لما اصير اسمع هذا الصوت اشبع بصير. بس كيف بدك تعمليه او بدك تعمله؟ Design the experiment for us. How would you want to do this? So this has to do with timing. Okay, when do you want to time the stimulus? You actually want to do it in a way that would actually exactly when you're done eating, you ring a bell, or when you're done eating, actually you start thinking about you start actually kind of introducing something, a smell, or basically a sound or a touch or something like this that relates to that. So yes, you can train yourself on basically primarily anything. So that's how it works. أذان المغرب exactly يعني basically مش بس أذان المغرب. Basically if you think about القرآن اللي before actually they play before أذان المغرب, that's when you start salivating. تخيلوا معي. So هنا that's actually a perfect example of a CS of a US becoming a CS, So that's that shows you. ولسه في عندنا شيء بنسميه sequence learning. This is actually even a different layer and a sequence of things that you can actually think about. على كل طيب إذا كان عندي أنا association between a stimulus and a response, or a CS and a US and a UR, or a CS and a CR, basically. يعني مثلا لو عملنا fear learning, basically in this kind of context, where we introduced a CS, a tone that predicts a shock, and صار الرات عندي يعمل freezing. إذا صار عندي CS that is associated with a shock. وبنعرف إنه CR is going to be freezing. So CS, shock. Can I actually deassociate الستيمولس هذا من الشوك perception؟ يعني إذا أنا بسمع صوت انفجار أو بسمع صوت انفجار in one context في غزة، أو بسمع صوت ألعاب نارية في نيويورك، هو انفجار، اثنين انفجار، أوكي؟ كيف ممكن أفرق إنه هذا الانفجار would actually mean that I'll freeze والانفجار الثاني would not؟ شو اللي بيفرق؟ What's the difference? In this kind of case, what we call the context. If you want to extinguish, this is what we call extinction learning. If you want to extinguish the association between the CS and the US, you need to create what we call a new context. في الحالة اللي كنت أحكيها is the place. Explosion here versus explosion there. And ultimately مثلا اللي عندهم basically somebody who got مثلا who has claustrophobia مثلا, um, and they got a panic attack when they were in the elevator, and then you put them in a room that is small. إذا الcontext الأول elevator and they got panic attack, the response, and the context الثاني is basically being in the room and maybe a little bit larger room and not getting the panic attack. How can we train them? It's basically again what we call extinction, getting the same CS and actually associating it with the US in one context and not associating it with the US in a different context. So presence of US or absence of the US. بس لاحظوا معي, extinction is not erasure of memory. Okay? يعني أنا ما بمسح الأسوسيشن بين السي اس واليو اس في الكونتكست الأول. And that's actually extremely important. So it's a formation of a new memory. It's not erasure of memory. It's a new form of memory that actually the CS does not predict the US in the second context. واضح? So this is how I want you to what I want you to consider when it comes to extinction learning. So في عندنا learning, في عندنا extinction. When you extinguish a fire, you put down the fire. When we extinguish a CS-US association, we present the CS without the US in a new context. تمام. بناء على هذا الكلام, let's go through some quick examples. And I think we're nearing the end of this of the timing of the lecture. I just want to make sure that we reserve enough time for the the neural circuitry and the rest of the stuff. في concept بنسميه blocking. What does blocking mean? Blocking basically means لما يكون عندي أنا CS-US association, I formed that CS-US association, and صار عندي CS-CR in this kind of context, all right? يعني we present the tone that predicts a shock, and the rat starts freezing. When you present the tone, the rat starts freezing. طيب بعد التريننج هذا لو جيت حطيت مع التون light, التون والlight predict shock, the rat is still freezing. طب لو حطيت اللايت لحاله, would it predict freezing? The answer is no. ليش؟ لأنه صار عندي شيء بسميه blocking. Kamen's blocking. بسميه Kamen's blocking paradigm. ليش؟ لأنه افترضوا إنه أنا عندي عدد من الunits of learning that are related to the CS. أجا التون أخذهم كلهم. لما أنا حطيت اللايت, it didn't really have any kind of remaining learning blocks to occupy. Therefore, it didn't really have any effect. بناء على هذا الكلام, the CS tone would predict the shock and result in freezing. The CS light would not predict the shock and therefore will not lead to freezing. Got the point? هذا بنسميه blocking. This is another concept that you need to be aware of. طب كيف هذا? How does this happen? Actually, it came down to two really amazing scientists, Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner, in the 70s. And basically, they came up with what was later known as the Rescorla-Wagner model. And شيء اسمه error correction. أو the whole concept of prediction error. Prediction error. شو اللي بصير في error correction? You're playing tennis مثلا. You hit the ball with a racket. Then the ball comes in, short of the net. إذن you want to correct the error. فالترايل اللي بعدها, you hit the ball with a little bit more strength so that it crosses the net. أو you hit the ball with a racket, and then ultimately it goes outside, the tennis field, and therefore next trial you correct the error by hitting the ball a little bit with a little bit less power. Therefore, it actually is hitting the target or the goal. If you hit the ball and it hits the target, there's nothing to do. It works. Okay? إذا في عندي error correction, يا إما lower power, يا إما higher power, so that you accomplish the goal that we're talking about here. Got it? So that is called error correction. And ultimately, الفرق بين when the ball actually came short of the net, الفرق بين expected, which is the ball hitting its target, and the obtained, which is the ball being short of the net, is what we call prediction error. Okay? The prediction error هو عبارة عن عكس learning. If I learn something, it's learned, عارف شو association, that's a state. إذا أنا عارف إنه اللي توقعته غير عن اللي أخذته, okay? This creates a difference. وبناء عليه, need to mend the gap between the expected and the obtained to accomplish learning. Okay? So it's an antithesis of that in this kind of case. Got it? So عندي either positive error or negative error. Positive prediction error or negative prediction error in this kind of regard. طيب, how can we use this to explain blocking? حكينا blocking, CS, US, CR, okay? Tone, shock, freezing. بس لما جي حطيت tone light, shock, freezing, and I tested light, it did not produce freezing. ليش؟ Then when we trained initially on the CS tone, it actually took all the weight. When the training صار عندي learning is at full at 1 in this kind of case. فما ضل عندي prediction error. لما ضفت light, it didn't really have, basically, it did not really have any kind of effect. The weight was 0 for light. فمشان هيك when I put light in, there's actually no freezing or in the eye blink conditioning paradigm. Got it? So this is actually how the concept of prediction error, the concept of error correction, actually could explain the whole concept of blocking. And this has been used, actually applied by Gordon Bower. Gordon Bower is my academic grandfather at Stanford, to understand what we call category learning. And actually, هذا paradigm is actually this is the foundations of what we right now call reinforcement learning in machine learning. Okay, how you can do classification, how you can do category learning. This is the father of it, Gordon Bower at Stanford. And basically and of course, rule generalization and so on and so forth. What Bower did was actually seeing how can we use the error correction concept in order to produce better categorization. And then ultimately, زي ما انتم شايفين, in the phase 1 training, you introduce these particular concepts, and مثلا either a circle or a triangle. Then you put a dot on top or at the bottom, basically, of these stimuli, and then you do the testing, whether you select. So شو اللي هون اللي بيهمني أنا? Which feature of the stimulus is at play here to produce the outcome? Is it the shape of the stimulus or the position of the dot? And then ultimately you form a rule, and this rule would be considered as a category. And that's actually apparently follows the same error correction paradigm that we talked about. With trials, you learn the rule and you start applying the rule subsequently. Got it? So that's actually the whole idea behind. We'll talk about the cerebellar function aspect of it in a second. Hopefully we'll get there very soon because we're at time. So yes, basically it's something that is very relevant. Does it mean that the light was ignored because the tone took all the rat attention? Yes, that's actually another model غير عن السكورلا Wagner model. بنسميه the attentional model of learning. The CS took all of the attentional resources, and therefore it was not really considered as a source of information. Yes, so that's actually another way of looking at it. It's not all of the weight goes to it to produce the CR, but it's actually, CS نفسه في reserved, again, processing units, and the tone took all of them, left nothing to the light. تمام. إذن and basically this is Gluckenbauer, the Gluckenbauer model for category learning, and it can show you very clearly how these kind of error correction weights happen and how does that actually serve this particular aspect of CSUS associations. طيب. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, which is the stimulus attention. It's called actually the Macintosh model that is related to this particular aspect of error correction. بس خلينا نشوف ليش صار مهم إن ناخذ the other model, which is attention related model. So basically it came to the point of what we call latent inhibition. So if we have a control group that sits idly in a chamber, and then actually we give them a tone. We expose the rats to a tone. And this tone basically predicts nothing. إذا جينا عملنا, and actually we tried to actually train the same individual على إنه tone predicts a shock. Got it? It actually does not really work. يعني, in other words, if I have a group of rats, they're sitting in their chamber, they're not exposed to anything, you train them on a tone shock association, they will learn the tone shock association and they'll start freezing. إذا جبت مجموعة ثانية من الراتس, عرضتهم للتون قبل ما أعرضهم للتون shock association, بعدين عرضتهم للتون shock association, it doesn't work. They don't freeze. So what happens here? Apparently the tone predicts nothingness. It was still a neutral stimulus. and therefore it does not really affect the conditioning component of what happens here. وهذا بنسميه latent inhibition. It's inhibition of the learning later. Okay, عشان هيك بنسميه latent inhibition. And error correction المفروض انه التون هذا it was not associated with anything. طب ليش بطل يعمل freezing? The Ricola-Wagner model fails to explain this, and therefore it does not really give us satisfactory results. ولكن basically إذا احنا بنستعمل CS stimulus basically theory of attentional resources, this actually perfectly explains it. لأنه I used all of my attentional resources على CS, which is basically saying CS, but there's nothing. So I learned the CS without the association to the US. بعدين لما اجى CS US association ما كان عندي attentional resources to dedicate for the CS US association. Got it? So that theory, the Macintosh theory of attentional resources, actually, or attentional bias, is what we consider in this kind of case. All right? As you can see here, this is the control group learning the association. This is the pre-exposure exposure group. They still learn, but with this kind of latent inhibition effect. Got it? تمام. Let's see. Another aspect, quick aspect, is the timing. ايش بنسميه inter-stimulus interval. The separation between the presentation of the CS and the presentation of the US. Tone and shock. ممكن أنا أعطي tone now and then wait 10 seconds and then أعطي shock. Got it? And then basically somebody's asking the question, after a while they will freeze or not? About what exactly? Could you clarify, please? So basically what we call in terms of the timing aspect of things is that we call it trace conditioning. يعني إذا أنا أعطيت التone right now and then waited 10 or 20 seconds, this is what is called delayed conditioning. All right? طبعا the larger the distance, the weaker the association, the weaker the performance. And then ultimately this is what's called trace conditioning, and it's associated with a different kind of neural circuitry that we will discuss very briefly as well at the very end. Okay, let's see here. طيب, let's talk for just 5 minutes and then I promise I'll give you guys a break. I know it's tiresome, by the way, علي as well, so to tell you the truth, but يعني, let's see if we can get over this very quickly. So we have, let me see here. Puff and hippocampus CS modulation. Okay. Let's just cover the initially. Let's cover this basically. I think that's actually the most important. So the question is here, I'm talking about the latent inhibition in the rats. So for the latent inhibition, if the rats were pre-exposed to the CS, they don't express the CR. Got it? Sufficiently. So they can be exposed to the tone. When you train them on a tone shock association, they don't learn it as well. ليش؟ لأنه ال CS resources were already consumed initially. Got it? إذا كانوا مش متعرضين لل CS, then basically it becomes much more efficient, the learning. Answers the question? All right. So خلينا نشوف, let's study this kind of eye blink conditioning circuit a little bit and see. So when you're talking about the reception of the CS, it's usually through pontine nuclei. You know, that's actually where the auditory and visual systems project. And then we receive the CS information. And apparently it takes, the input takes that to the deep cerebellar nuclei. راح نحكي بكرة على الcerebellum, نشوف كيف the role of the cerebellum in movement, but as you will hear, there's something called the deep cerebellar nuclei. And then ultimately, this takes the CS information to what we call the granule cell that actually in the cerebellar cortex that forms what we call the parallel fiber. The parallel fiber connects on the Purkinje cell or Purkinje cell, whatever you want to call it. And then ultimately, في عندي another input that is coming, which is the CS being associated with ايش حكينا with the US. So the US information وين تيجي من the inferior olive. And then actually, the inferior olive also sends projections to the Purkinje cell. So the association happens in the cerebellum. So بس شوفوا ديروا بالكم احنا in the training phase بعده مش صاير UR بعده مش صاير CR UR بعده مش صاير CR. So CS is associated with the US that is associated with the UR, which is the eye blink, which also happens through basically the cerebellar control of the output pathway. All right? So in this kind of case, in the brainstem as well as the interpositus nucleus in the cerebellum. So that being said, what we're talking about is with training, we give the CS input and this circuit starts happening where it goes into the deep cerebellar nuclei, to the cerebellar cortex, to the Purkinje cells, which actually projects to the interpositus deep in the cerebellum. And then ultimately gives this the UR. But later we realize that actually the pontine nuclei give a collateral. This is the other branch, the other projection that goes directly to the interpositus. فلاحقا في التريننج لما I don't even present the US, which is the air puff, it actually goes through this pathway. شايفين كيف؟ So when it starts going through the interpositus, let me show you the firing of these neurons. So basically, as you can see this is the untrained rabbit, and this is the interpositus nucleus activity. And you see the CS presentation does not really lead to any activity. By day 2, the CS and the US presentation leads to an activity. And then طبعا the US leads to an activity لأن احنا عارفين basically إنه الاير puff will lead to a blink, an eye blink. بس لما أعطي CS لحاله with the أو أعمل association with the US بصير الانترpositus فيها activity. And then ultimately after a little while you will see that actually even just presenting the CS on its own will basically give us the activity زي ما انتم شايفين. So كمان مرة initially the untrained rabbit, the US gave the activity in the interpositus. With the training, the CS was the one that gave the activity in the interpositus nucleus in the deep cerebellar nuclei. وشوفوا that's actually what happens in terms of the Purkinje cells or Purkinje cells. There is actually loss of function, or not loss of function, I'm sorry, the decrease in firing, basically when the air puff, when the US is being presented. All right, and you see this actually with cerebellar damage. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, as a basically as a way to consider this, to consider this particular pathway. Another actually neural pathway that you need to know about is related to what we call the hippocampus. Again, you will talk about it in the context of memory, hopefully much more details مع الدكتور حاتم. And ultimately, in terms of the hippocampus, اللي بيهمنا في الهيبوكامبس is the context. We encode the context. إذا بناء عليه, you would imagine actually it's going to be really important for the extinction behavior. And then ultimately, if I cannot process context information, I cannot do extinction. Therefore, people with hippocampal damage, they're unable to do extinction in this kind of regard or create the rules. And that's actually there's another set of experiments related to, the work of Eric Kandel with aplasia. And basically, you can see that, this kind of CS-US association becomes more automatic, and just the presentation of the CS is going to be important for the production of the response. Look at it on your own, guys. It's another example that you can actually take a look at. على كل. We'll talk about these clinical perspectives at the end of the lecture. Classical conditioning with instrumental conditioning in more details. Let me stop for now, give you guys a small break, and then we can resume. And any questions so far? All right, if there are no other questions at this point, unless somebody posts a question as I'm speaking, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back here at 3:20, and then we'll resume our discussion. We'll talk next about instrumental conditioning. شو الفرق بين Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning in these particular paradigms? We'll talk about neural circuitry, وبعدين نحكي على clinical applications for both Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning. Okay, guys, we'll see you in a bit, in 10 minutes. Okay, so let's go back and get started again. Let's see if there are any questions, and we'll answer them momentarily. Where's that? Here it is. Okay. Okay, the question is about the first lecture, when REM sleep is wakefulness minus the muscle movement. Isn't the muscle tone in REM close to the wakefulness? We have atonia in REM sleep. Okay? Muscle tone goes significantly down. You're unable to move your muscles, right? Isn't that what we talked about? Again, the person who asked the question. With REM sleep, you lose muscle tone. No. Non-REM, it's not related to the muscle tone as in REM. ذكر شو حكينا. REM sleep is very similar to wakefulness in terms of the functionalities of the heart rate, respiratory rate, and everything else, except for, of course, you're uh, not fully conscious, but at the same time, you can't move your body. That's actually what matters, except for the eyes, طبعا, while they're closed. In non-REM, no, it's not the same. You can move around when you're in non-REM. Got it? So REM sleep is about atonia. And again, REM behavior disorder is when you don't lose this tone, this muscle tone, and you start actually kind of acting violent in REM sleep. Okay? Okay, very good. Let's talk about instrumental conditioning. And again, you know, مثل ما اتفقنا سابقا, we'll focus on a few concepts. يعني بديش اياكم تستصعبوا من الاشياء، ان الهدف مش تعقيد الامور هنا. الهدف يكون عندكم material that you can go back to and read and enjoy reading, hopefully. If this is going to be a positive reinforcer for you guys to start reading and to start learning new things, then so be it. الهدف تبعنا مش الامتحان. What brings me here every year is not actually to enforce مين بيجيب عالي بالامتحان. I honestly couldn't care less. Okay. الهدف هون مش انه to kind of just focus narrowly focus on the exam. It's what you can learn from this. So focus, if you're interested in passing the exam, attend the lecture and hear what I'm saying. If you're interested in passing the exam, attend the lecture, hear what I'm saying. If you want to do fantastic, read the material, okay, and take notes. If you want to get 100, read the book, okay. اشرح لكم بالعربي لغة العلم انجليزي يعني basically. أو كيف اشرح لكم بالعربي؟ How do you want me؟ ما بحاول يعني I try my best. احكي بالعربي بالانجليزي مشان توصل الفكرة. اذا مش واضحة احكوا لي. I asked you from the beginning, guys. اوكي، بالعربي بقدرش احكي كامل بالعربي لانه it's not the language of the text. لازم تعرفوا تحكوا انجليزي، لازم تعرفوا تقراوا انجليزي. So that's actually extremely important for you guys. Got it? انا يعني nothing would make me happier انه نصير نحكي كامل بالعربي. بس it's not how things work, unfortunately. We're not in that time period anymore. Maybe that was 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago when science was written بالعربي, and before that it was in Latin, and before that it was in Greek, and humanity develops, I don't know, to the best or the worst, or the worst, basically. So I'm not here to judge. So don't quote me. Anyways, خلينا نحكي على operant conditioning. And again, quick concepts. في Pavlovian conditioning كنا نحكي عن CS, US, UR that converts into CR. Okay. Another question: how to raise alertness during studying or learning? That's a very good question, actually, and we can use what we learned so far to try to understand, to actually do this. The most important aspect in learning is to keep the prediction error high. يعني change the context, change the way that you sit. change basically مرة اسمعوا المحاضرة سماع، مرة اقرأوا الكتاب، مرة اقرأوا notes، مرة حطوا background music. So keep changing the environment. That actually helps a lot. Use multiple modalities for the same piece of information. Excuse me. To guarantee that you will remember it. يعني المعلومة اللي بدكم تتذكروها بسمعها وبشوفها and actually I discuss it with somebody, I talk about it, okay? So different routes of expression and reception helps a lot. مهم جدا actually, and I'll attend to this, hopefully I'll have a few minutes to attend to this by the end. Sufficient and good sleep or good sleep quality is extremely important so you can become alert and can stay alert. Not too much caffeine, properly, regular exercise. These are extremely important things that actually you should really focus on if you care about your well-being. And not just well-being in terms of health, well-being in terms of studying, and well-being in terms of learning. And if you adopt these habits, this actually becomes part of your daily your regular routine, and it can significantly help you do better. الموضوع مش بس مشان بدي انا انظم النوم تبعي ولا بدي اظبط النوم تبعي. It actually helps you on all other fronts. So that's extremely important. So multiple factors that you can actually use, and you can actually trace all of them back to the behaviors that we're talking about. Okay? I hope this helps. I'll be happy to discuss further, but let's focus on the lectures. How many hours should we sleep? The National Sleep Foundation says between 6 and 10 hours, or 7 to 9 hours on average. بس طبعا people vary. Depends on your needs. Okay, operant conditioning. Basically, operant conditioning, the time for sleep, again, it depends on you guys, but preferably, between usually, if we're talking about an average of 8 hours, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., where the mid sleep point is at around basically 2 a.m. So if your mid sleep point is at between 2 and 4 a.m., you're good, okay? So that's something that you should consider as well. على كل stimulus response outcome. So بالبداية حكينا عن conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and response. UR and the CR later, okay? That's what we call Pavlovian or classical conditioning. طيب لما أنا أشوف stimulus and الستيمولس هذا بيضطرني إني أعمل action, and بناء على الأكشن راح يتحدد إذا راح آخذ الأوتكم ولا لا. يصير behavioral paradigm مختلف. شوفوا لاحظوا معي في البداية كان عندي tone and shock and freezing. طبعا الشوك comes with pain, so the negative aspect of it is always there. ما بتغيرش مع الشوك. الأوتكم is always there. Okay? Let's focus on the lecture right now. We'll ask these questions by the end of the lecture, so keep it. We'll answer it later. All right? So basically بناء على هذا الكلام في عندي conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and a conditioned response. بس outcome basically in this kind of context, not the response, the pain that is related with a shock, is always there. So what can we actually avoid the pain that is associated with a shock? The answer is no. It's always there. Can we avoid the satiety or the pleasure that is related with consuming the food? In the case of Pavlov's dog, the answer is no. It's always there. Even I have no control over the outcome in this kind of case. The outcome is always there في Pavlovian conditioning, في classical conditioning اللي ناقشنا في الساعة الأولى. بس في operant conditioning, في instrumental conditioning, it's different. I see a stimulus, I make a response, and that decides whether I get to the outcome or I don't get to the outcome. Got it? إذن هون الفرق is actually really very, very key, which is stimulus, response, outcome, as opposed to stimulus, basically another kind of innate stimulus, which is the US, and then a response. فيش عندي outcome لأن outcome ثابت مثل ما اتفقنا. All right? بلش هذا الكلام in the 1920s, the studies in this kind of regard, with Edward Thorndike and his cat experiments. Actually, if you YouTube his name, you put Thorndike cat experiments, you will see actually a very nice set of reports about his experiments. How Edward Thorndike taught a cat how to make a sequence of actions, again, with a particular stimulus, which is the sight or the smell of the food. the cat would actually figure out how to get out of a maze that he created. يعني تخيلوا كيف تتعلم البسة كيف تفتح الباب و it does things in sequence so that it can get to the food. إذا ما عملت الأشياء هي بالsequence it doesn't get to the food. So that's actually something that is extremely important to think about. إنه getting to the outcome is hinging on responding to particular stimulus. Okay? واضحة الفكرة هون يا جماعة؟ Stimulus, response, outcome. Instrumental or operant conditioning. مقارنة في CS, US, response, UR and then CR. في البافلوفيان or classical conditioning ذكروا هاي الأشياء. طيب ممتاز. إذا let's actually kind of break this down as well. You know, stimulus, response, and outcome. And basically, as you can see here, it's a chain of things. It's a chain of things. So it has always to follow that, has always or needs to follow that chain all the time. And basically, that's what is differentiating this particular paradigm again from classical conditioning. طيب, let's talk about a few concepts in this kind of regard. يعني, how can we translate this to rat experiments? You put a hungry rat in a Skinner box that we called it earlier, and based on the Skinner box, the rat is hungry. We have a lever, so basically the rat starts pressing the lever, and the lever starts producing food. It's dispensing the food بناء على pressing the lever. And then ultimately, the stimulus is being in a Skinner box, or basically the lever or the food dispenser. The action is, or the response is pressing the lever, and the outcome is getting the food based on the lever presses. And can you actually extinguish this behavior? The answer is absolutely yes. You can make the rat actually press a lever to get the food. بعدين, at some point, the lever pressing stops actually giving the rat food, therefore you can extinguish it. ببطل يحط ايده على الليفر الرات, because it's not producing the outcome anymore. As opposed to, شو تذكروا شو يعني كان extinction في Pavlovian conditioning. حطينا CS والUS in a different context, association, where basically the CS in one context is associated with the US, and the CS is in a different context is not associated with the US. Got it? هون الفرق. Response is associated with the outcome, and we remove that. We take it out. Got it? So the response is not associated with the outcome, or associated with no outcome in this kind of context. طيب. بناء على هذا الكلام, outcome could actually, عفوا, stimulus could be related to different kinds of outcome in this kind of case. It could be positive outcome, it could be negative outcome, it could be no outcome. All right? So بنسميها positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement or punishment, and no feedback or no outcomes. بناء على هذا الكلام. And actually this is extremely important. ليش؟ لأنه when you get to the point of trying to understand things related to positive things, such as drug addiction, and how people actually get used to drugs, it's this kind of positive thing that they're always seeking. They're doing the same exact set of behaviors based on a particular stimulus to get to the same level of pleasure. So that could actually explain parts of what we call drug abuse in this kind of regard. Okay? So again, related to training animals, you can actually, if there is an outcome, they'll do the necessary responses. If there is a stimulus, you give the animal a stimulus. Like how do you get this squirrel to slide on the snow? It's a sequence of things. So we call it chaining actually. So you teach the squirrel that if you do behavior one, if you actually I show you the stimulus, you respond in this way, you'll get a positive reward, and then you start chaining to that. So if I show you the stimulus, you do behavior 1, 2, 3, 4, then you get the reward. So it becomes a series of actions that the squirrel or the rat needs to do in order to be able to get the reward and to get the outcome. What is it called? Positive reward stops. Positive reward stops is a different concept. I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about. Positive, I didn't say positive reward stops. Could you please clarify so that I could answer your question? So basically, in this kind of concept, so we have this kind of chaining of either stimuli or responses in order to be able to basically relate a particular stimulus with particular sets of responses or response and the particular outcome. So is that the case only in positive outcome, or also the negative? If the outcome stops, the response stops. Yeah, supposedly, you know. If you don't, so in the negative, you want to do the response that actually seizes the negative outcome. لو حكيت لك انا او حكيت لك انه basically عندي stimulus. If you select A, you get punished. If you select B, you get nothing. Then you'll learn to select B, basically. Avoid selecting A, you see? If I tell you if you select A, you get rewarded for another stimulus, and if you select B, you get nothing, you learn or teach yourself to select A to maximize the reward. All right? So giving or stopping the outcome, yes, will do extinction. This is what we called extinction. إذا بتتذكروا في example تبعت الرات. When the lever press stopped dispensing the food, then basically this reduced the responding. Got it? Okay? It does reduce the responding. It doesn't stop it completely, not all the time. But basically, that's that's actually what you get there. All right. So there is a whole concept of primary, secondary reinforcers. This is actually something else that you should consider. I'm not going to focus on that too much. This is too behavioral for you guys. أنا بدي أوصل للنقطة اللي نحكي فيها على neural circuits for this and basically see how we can actually function in this kind of regard. So كمان مرة يعني most of this I want you, if you want to read it for pleasure. I don't mind. بس ركزوا على النقاط اللي بحكيها فقط, and then actually so that we can actually go through the material that I want to cover so that we understand the neural circuits. There are a few things I want you to know about this. Timing effect similar to what we call trace conditioning. إذا كان في عندي شيء سميناه سابقا في البافلوفيان conditioning interstimulus interval بين السي اس واليو اس. هون احنا بنسمي actually بيكون بين الريسبونس and producing and actually providing the outcome. كل ما طالت مدة الفصل بين الريسبونس والاوتكم كل ما خف reinforcing effect للاوتكم. اوكي؟ ليش؟ لانه نبعد الفترة الزمنية بصير associative ability is much less. Okay? So that's actually how time functions in this kind of regard. Something that is also extremely important. So طبعا عندنا positive issue بنسميه positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. That actually relates to positive reinforcement is adding the reinforcer, okay? And then there is a negative reinforcement when you remove the reinforcer, okay? So this could work for reward and punishment. For positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement could work for, positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers, all right? Therefore, we could add a positive reinforcer or omit a positive reinforcer. Add a negative reinforcer or omit a negative reinforcer. مثل ما شفنا, selecting A leads to punishment, or selecting B omits the punishment, removes the risk of the punishment. How long does it take to extinguish the action? Depends on the behavior, okay? So usually you're talking about over trials. خلينا بس نرجع كمان مرة هون على الرات experiment. You're asking about extinction. مشان نشوف كم trial أخذت الرات to, or how many minutes basically to extinguish. As you can see here, it took 13 minutes to train them, and then it took another basically 11 minutes to extinguish them. Got it? So it's time related and trial related طبعا. It depends on the behavior. Okay, doke. So basically, based on this understanding of positive and negative, adding or omitting a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer, we can understand it's not a simple thing. It could be related to the presence or the absence of the reinforcer, and it could be related to basically the valence of the reinforcer. Is it positive or negative as well? طيب. Let's talk a little bit about the delivery schedules of the outcome. So زي ما حكينا بالنسبة للstimulus, the presentation of the stimulus or the presentation of the response could relate to the presentation of the outcome. فإيش بنسميه fixed ratio and something that is called fixed interval. These are two concepts I want you to know. Fixed ratio is, basically with a fixed number of responses, you get the outcome. If you see a stimulus with a fixed number of responses, you see the outcome, okay? Fixed ratio is that with a fixed time, you get the outcome. Like making the response in a fixed particular time, you get the outcome. All right? So for example, if I give you a stimulus and you make 2 lever presses within 2 seconds of presentation of the stimulus, the rat, they get the food or they get the water in this kind of regard. So very simple, again, very simple concept in this kind of regard that you should be aware of. على كل. Let's see here. It has a lot to do with what we call behavioral economy and how you actually think about this in the context of reinforcement learning. طبعا بس مشان تكونوا عارفين يعني ممكن حد يجي يحكي لي طب this is too psychological. It's actually this is not psychology. This is what we call machine learning. Okay? Ultimately لأنه إذا بتطلعوا على شيء بنسميه reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is a branch of machine learning these days. If you think about something like ChatGPT currently, it was actually trained with this particular approach. It's actually used to train robots and teach robotic arms to do surgery and ultimately even train all of these machine learning models that we work with in order to do better and to do self-teaching signals. So it's extremely important for you to really know the details of this and to understand them. The PREMAC principle, which is responses as reinforcers, is another concept I want you to know, which is basically احنا دايما بنحكي على stimulus response outcome. طب could the response become reinforcing? And why is that important? لأنه إذا بتلاحظوا عندنا stimulus response and then response outcome. واحد بنسميه goal directed behavior and the other is called habitual learning, and we'll talk about this in a second. Actually, there are some studies on that. تقدر تشوفوا في additional reading about how we can think about goal-directed behavior in the context of ADHD in kids, مثلا, in the context of depression, in the context of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and so on and so forth. And then at some point, the response carries the reinforcement. It becomes the rewarding or the punishing component, even if you remove the reward or punishment. Got it? So this is the principle that I'm going to talk about. طيب. Let's talk about this in the context of neural circuits in the remaining 10 minutes or something. And then we'll talk about, for 5 minutes, we'll talk about clinical applications. حكينا على basal ganglia circuitry امبارح and how it's affected in Parkinson's disease. And ultimately, you need to know something that actually, when it gets to the basal ganglia, it's not just an extrapyramidal motor system. It has a lot to do with your ability to learn, especially this kind of learning, which we call reinforcement learning, or which we call instrumental conditioning, or even Pavlovian conditioning. How does that work? A lot of people think about this, association, basically between a stimulus and a response and an outcome as being extremely key, extremely important, using the architecture of the basal ganglia. Should I select response 1 or response 2? بذكركم في ايش بالبيزل ganglia? Is this a direct pathway or the indirect pathway? تيجينا الcortex, it sends actually input على البيزل ganglia على striatum, says I have this stimulus and you can do either select category A or category B. What should I do? You see? So dopamine is extremely important as well here in terms of encoding what we call the prediction error in this kind of context. بس في instrumental conditioning مش في Pavlovian conditioning هنا, which is basically if I select A, would I get the reward or not? So if I select A and get the reward, zero prediction error لأنه expected is exactly the same as the obtained. But if I select A and don't get the reward, then I have a negative prediction error. Then I need next time when I see the same exact behavior, I need to select the other option to do that. So بس في مسألة مهمة جدا I want you to think about when it comes to this. So حكينا عن behavioral aspect of this, which is stimulus response. If I see a stimulus, which response should I select? And based on that, the outcome. And ultimately, there is a difference between wanting something, and liking something. So if you get a positive reward for rats, for example, if they get a sugar water, which is a positive reinforcer, does this mean that, for example, dopamine and the basal ganglia is involved in the pleasure component of it? Does it mean that the response that we do is to maximize pleasure? That's not necessarily the case. That's not necessarily the case, because basically dopamine and the basal ganglia circuitry is important for the motivation, the wanting, the approach toward getting the reward. بينما the liking fact is related to endorphins and other neurotransmitter systems. So it's not dopamine related. The motivation, the wanting component, the approach to get something is dopamine related. So لما يكون عندي stimulus response outcome, the responding component, by identifying the stimulus at the cortex, the responding component to get to the outcome is where the basal ganglia and the dopamine circuitry is involved. But after you get the outcome and enjoy it, enjoyment is not dopamine and basal ganglia related. All right? Important point in this kind of context. خلينا نشوف بس شغله مهمه جدا بالنسبه للدوبامين and dopamine agonists and basically how dopamine affects learning in Parkinson's disease. You see على سبيل المثال في Parkinson's disease, because of loss of dopamine, you see selective inability for Parkinson's patients to learn positive feedback, but not negative feedback. And again, this relates to the deficit in the direct pathway, but not in the indirect pathway of the basal ganglia and the loss of the dopamine signal. بس هذا ما معناه إنه الدوبامين له علاقة في الهيدونيك component, the liking component of the positive feedback. It's actually about the approach of the positive feedback. اللي له علاقة في direct pathway of the basal ganglia. Okay? All right. And endogenous opioids is the liking component. And basically, as we discussed earlier. And for punishment, it's a little bit of a different pathway that involves another structure in the brain that we call the insula, especially the anterior part of the insula. And we'll talk about this more in detail, inshallah, يوم السبت, in the lecture about executive function, and we'll get that and actually focus on that as well. ليش هذا كلام مهم? Again, in the last 5 or 10 minutes, if you allow me, guys. لأنه الstimulus response outcome أو CSUS-CR paradigms are very important for understanding behavioral disorders or mental health disorders or neurological disorders. Addiction is one key aspect of things. إذا لو بدي أسأل سؤال هنا, when it comes to addiction, is dopamine involved in addiction? إذا أنا باجي بحكي على wanting versus liking, is it involved in the pleasure component? ولا the behavior to produce the pleasure component? What do you think? Any ideas? It's involved in the behavior. It's involved in the wanting, not the liking. Okay? Got it? So that's actually what really matters here. إذن ليش الناس اللي why would people want actually to when people are cocaine addicts مثلا, all right? They want to take cocaine. Cocaine, we know that actually it significantly increases the release of dopamine, but not just dopamine, but also, basically endogenous opioids and endorphins. So basically the addiction behavior is what drives the responding to increase their level of dopamine and ultimately increase the level of endogenous opioids that would ultimately give the pleasure aspect of it. So عندي multiple components. هذا فهمنا إنه في stimulus that would lead to the response, that would lead to the outcome, the positive outcome. Then, in other words, if I can replicate the stimulus change the behavior, the responding, and give similar outcome without the toxic effect of it, I can treat the patient. You see? كمان مرة, stimulus, response, outcome. For a cocaine addict, the responding, which is injecting themselves with cocaine or taking cocaine, نحن نعرف الكوكايين pharmacologically increases the concentration of dopamine, but also affects opioids, endogenous opioids, okay? And endorphins, gives the pleasurable, or the pleasure component, the liking component, all right? But dopamine also enhances the doing, the wanting component. فبناء عليه, how can I treat a patient with addiction? بناء على النولج تبعتي على stimulus, response, outcome, all right? It's actually related to, again, relearning the stimulus, relearning the response that I do, and producing a similar outcome. عشان هيك بستعمل الأمفيتامينز in this, in a different context, to treat patients. Amphetamines do something similar in terms of producing dopamine in the brain, and then ultimately lead to basically to similar, liking effect. But you use this to modify the previous two steps, which is the stimulus and the response, in order to produce new learning. Okay. So that being said, it's extremely key that we understand exactly. So we give them the same outcome or similar outcome, not exactly the same. Cocaine is very potent in comparison to amphetamines. We give them only a portion of the outcome, but with a different chain of things, stimulus and response, so that we can change it. We can change basically the behavioral aspect of it. مش معناته إنه بنمسح memory. We don't. We only give them new learning so that they can actually functionally become more efficient at controlling their urges. لأن a lot of it is automatic. مثل ما حكينا, habit learning. لما يشوفوا stimulus, they do the response immediately. So it becomes stimulus response. They don't care about the outcome لأنه they عارفين شو الoutcome. لأنه بالنسبة لهم الoutcome is fixed. بس هون بنغير الoutcome مرات, أو بنعطي نفس الoutcome وبنغير stimulus response so that we can introduce a new outcome. Got it? So it's literally playing with these three components of the learning paradigm. Okay. طبعا behavioral addictions follow the same kind of rules, and the treatments is basically breaking this this cycle of stimulus response outcome. Okay. Quick coverage as well of the clinical perspectives of the dopamine is not the stimulus. The stimulus is مثلا being in a particular place. Again, it's a sensory aspect. Stimulus usually is a sensory thing. Visual, smell, taste, you see, sound, touch related. Got it? Oh, you want to make yourself addicted to studying? Of course, basically. Reinforce it. Say, if I finish reading this chapter, I'll treat myself to this and this and that. Make it contingent, you see? See the stimulus, do the response, and only if you do the response, get the outcome. So you can create a rewarding system for yourself, and you can train yourself. Yes. If you don't finish what you need to finish, you don't get the reward. So absolutely. So you become addicted to studying or reading, which is a fantastic addiction, basically. Not always, but it's just, I don't know, in this world that we live in, it apparently doesn't pay off to be smart. So I don't know what we're doing. Don't quote me again. على كل. So basically, similar paradigms in Pavlovian conditioning are actually extremely important to understand addiction, drug addiction. اللي هو كمان مرة لما أشوف stimulus, CS, and there is a US, another stimulus, okay, and there is an immediate response. So basically, think about it as follows. When I am, مثلا, you hear about a lot of these people, these, celebrities, I don't know what we call them, celebrities, actually dying in a bathtub in a hotel. ليش؟ نحلل الموضوع. Bathtub is a stimulus, CS. The US is usually, apparently, they take drugs at their home when they're in the bathtub. LUS, okay, which is the food aspect or the drug aspect of it. And the response is the euphoria, the happiness, the pleasure that they get out of that. طيب تخيلوا احنا جبنا هذا ال CS, US and CR or UR in this kind of context وراحوا على hotel room. الهوتيل room has a bathtub but it's not the same context. شو راح يصير عندي؟ In order to accomplish the same kind of response بصير هنا UR then. They don't know how much dose they should take but they end up overdosing and dying in hotel rooms. You see? So that's actually one thing, one way to think about why all of these celebrity deaths happen when in hotel rooms in this kind of context. على كل, there are other things actually. You can use classical as well as instrumental conditioning in order to to treat different types of disorders. For me, I use this a lot to study depression and clinical depression in the context of what happens. So overdose is a relative thing here. Yes, so overdose is a relative thing to accomplish the same kind of response that they get back home with a different context. So they end up overdosing most of the time and then dying. Some of them dying actually, you see, because of the overdose, because they are in a different context. ذكروا شو حكينا الextinction في Pavlovian conditioning. And then it's all about these behavioral changes, جماعة. Again, CS, US, response, stimulus, response, and outcome. And you can basically analyze anything behaviorally according to these particular aspects of the behavior. على كل, we'll cover other parts of this inshallah in the emotion lecture as well as the executive function lecture. There's one about dopamine. I'll talk to you about in more detail maybe tomorrow inshallah. And we'll revisit a little bit لما نحكي على cerebellum بكرة. We'll revisit a little bit this kind of interpositus cerebellar cortex pathway that relates to Pavlovian conditioning. بس كمان مرة اللي بيهمني إنه يكون الكونسبت واضحة. I'm not going to ask you about the details. Again, you're not being trained as cognitive neuroscientists or machine learning scientists here or AI scientists. الهدف إنه تعرفوا البيسك concepts هذه. مش راح أحاسبكم على كل الديتيلز. أنا اللي ممكن تقرأوها في العالم. أنا اللي بذكره بسألكم عنه. Okay? بس راح أسألكم على بناء على الفهم تبعكم للأمور هذه. So please make sure that you understand what I'm talking about. And basically الموضوع مش حفظ المصطلحات بس فهم المصطلحات اللي بنحكي فيها. يعني اللي سألني أحكي بالعربي بنحكي بالعربي حاليا. I hope this is clear. Okay? Any questions? So how do you want to help them? Oh, that's actually the point. So there is a question. Our colleague here says, I'm with you regarding this, but all stops when the individual really realizes that they can stop the chain consciously. And that's what defines humans. Well, sometimes people need help. You need to basically help them stop the chain. And not consciously. لأنه basically احنا اللي بنحكي عنه هنا is a little bit subconscious. الautomaticity اللي بنحكي عنها اللي هو stimulus response becomes automatic. كيف بتحطوا الباسورد تبعت الموبايل تبعكم؟ Do you think about it؟ لما تيجي تسوقوا السيارة do you think امتى بحرك الجير ولا بحط رجلي على البنزين ولا بحط رجلي على البريك؟ You don't. Becomes automatic. هذا بسميه procedural memory. Okay? So basically sometimes you need to realize that there is an underlying system that is at work here. And sometimes you need to basically think about how to consider these behavioral changes in order to think about how you can help the person. So أنا لما أغير الstimulus ولا أغير responding ولا أغير outcome, then I am helping that person without them knowing, not necessarily. That's actually a lot of the basics of psychotherapy. Depression and anxiety is related to this. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The changing the conscious sometimes happens later. Because if you change the subconscious, بيكون شو بنسميه bottom up approach. When you say change the subconscious, the conscious would respond. This is actually, sometimes you cannot solve all of the problems directly by trying to convince the person. Oh, هذا الكلام غلط. طيب, okay, هذا conscious aspect. You can try this with a 2-year-old. Try, basically try to convince them what is wrong, or try to take the outcome out. جربوا شو اللي بصير. بزبط معكم انه تحاولوا تقنعوا ولد صغير او بنت صغيره عمرها سنتين انه اللي بتعمله هذا خطأ. Good luck. So basically tell me if it works. بس اذا بتفرجوهم انه اذا عملتوا هذا الكلام بتاخذوش الاوتكم they will learn. You see? So there is always this kind of underlying behavioral aspect of things. Any other questions? Okay, Jamal. So I hope you learned something new and useful today. إن شاء الله بكرة نلتقي كمان مرة نحكي عن emotion, and we'll talk about the cerebellum as well for movement regulation of movements. I apologize, there was a miscoordination at my end in terms of the order of the lectures. But inshallah, it's going to be a short discussion about the cerebellum, and again, we'll cover some of the basic concepts, and inshallah, you'll learn something helpful and useful that would help you in becoming good doctors who help people. Until then, يعطيكم العافية والسلام عليكم.